To record and it says it's recording, right? Welcome everyone to our discussion of chapter 3 of Grossberg's book, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain. I always thought this topic of art and neuroscience, or psychology and neuroscience, is a very rich topic for cross pollination and interaction. So there's a whole lot here, a lot of food for thought, stuff to disagree with, agree with, quibble about. And there's no math in this chapter, but I think it sets up some stuff about how Steve thinks about vision. And it derives from things that other people have said before Steve also. So what can art tell us about the brain and vice versa? We kind of go in the vice versa order mostly in the chapter, and that's kind of what I'll do, but we'll see how it goes. A big topic to kind of address at the get-go, which is where philosophical debate starts, is the difference between seeing and knowing. The theme here is that art and illusion both reveal something important, and specifically about the Gestalt, which we'll get into. This particular chapter, plus some other links I've made, give us a good reason to understand why the word field was chosen in things like embedding fields, and why it wasn't just a sort of punt to something that sounds like physics. And I think that one way to think about what Grossberg has done in this domain in vision is to taking Gestalt principles and turning them into mathematical ideas, and using some additional theoretical ideas such as complementarity. So one theme that comes up, I haven't actually put too much about this in there, is that Steve thinks that complementarity is different from modularity. I think that the argument he makes in the book is not going to convince that many people, but maybe we can talk about that. We'll talk about this sort of yin-yang relationship between boundaries and surfaces, which I think is a very rich idea. And we'll talk about boundary webs, and maybe ask the question, if not answer, why do kids draw the way they do, as well as certain groups of people who used to be called primitive, but I won't use that word except with scare quotes. And yeah, so if we have time, we'll get to that. And maybe if we really have time, I'll end with some connections with Taoism. Okay, so seeing versus knowing. When you see this illusion, first of all, would anyone like to describe anything interesting or unusual about this particular illusion, the famous Ehrenstein illusion?
It looks like there's circles kind of floating there on top.
Cool. The floating part. Some people don't see it. Does anyone not get what Kale just said, the floating aspect? Just out of curiosity. Because
I didn't see them as floating at first. And then I was sort of thinking about it, and I was looking at them, and then I said, oh, they could be floating. That's kind of a gray zone. It's like there's sort of circles there. They're not really. It's very weak illusion.
Yeah, I think floating is one way to describe it. Other way is that there's an apparent brightness. That's one way to think about it. That there's sort of a highlight around those illusory circles. And I'm not necessarily going to answer this, but it's a question to keep in mind. But what do we actually mean by brightness in this context? So I keep feeling defensive about illusions, and maybe Steve does too, but I think you really can learn from illusions, but it's often one corner of visual neuroscience, and a lot of neuroscientists never really think about illusion. But I think they're very good questions that come out of it. Why are there so many? So it's like, what makes them possible? In what sense do illusions differ from reality? The ill part of the illusion. And why do not illusory percepts undermine successful adaptation to the real world? How does all this not interfere if it's possible? And so Steve's idea is that everything we see is a mentally constructed illusion that just happens to match the structure of reality very well. I think this just happens business is a little underselling the Darwinian part of the story. But also it's worth pointing out that there are versions of direct realists, in 2021 who really don't like the idea that what we see is mediated. They get very angry about this idea.
Johan, why is it underselling evolution when fitness itself is just good enough, right? So
just happens. Okay, the just happening is a million-year process. Fine.
The just happen is the equivalent of the just good enough that fitness.
Oh, I see. The just so story you mean?
Yeah, just good enough.
Okay. Yes, I'll grant that. And this point, which I've highlighted in blue, Steve doesn't actually mention it again in the chapter, so I certainly hope he brings it up again. Why many cultures have emphasized mystical states of mind that exploit the constructive properties of the mind. You could write a whole book just on that. So we'll have to bookmark that, and if we want, we can pick it up later, because he doesn't actually talk about it in this chapter. But it's a fascinating point, and I think an interesting way to talk to Buddhists or these neuro-Buddhists who are very convinced that there's an obvious alignment between the Buddhist idea that everything is just transitory and neuroscientific findings. It's like, well, what you infer from certain heightened or unusual states of mind can be interpreted in various ways, and we have to be careful about that. Okay, so a point that I picked up, which I wasn't completely aware of from this book by Ernst Gombrich, is that historically, particularly in the West, art itself, the whole thing has been seen as illusion, as a technology for producing illusions. And I don't mean in the sense of optical illusions as we understand them in memes and things. I mean, verisimilitude itself is an illusion. And this book was written in the 50s, and already modern art was coming up with a challenge to, a good 2,500 years of development in this technology. So I think this book is really well timed, because it sits right at the dawn of the cognitive era, looking back at this history of improvement of verisimilitude in art, and looking at the contemporary sort of people started looking down on verisimilitude at this point in the art world. And he's also kind of talking about contemporary stuff that's starting to happen in cognitive science. It's a really, really good book. And it kind of covers a lot of the types of ideas that were informing Grossberg at this time and a little later. So he makes the point that mimesis, the production of similar representations, is a big goal, particularly in Greek art, but definitely in other art traditions too. So it may be said that the progress of art towards the goal was to the ancient world what the progress of techniques is to the modern, the model of progress as such. And that's a very interesting kind of point to make. It's very heightened in Western history, but I think it's true across the board that there's this idea that things are getting better if you can make things more like reality. But by the 20th century, people are starting to get uncomfortable about all this. If you haven't seen this, this is the famous Magritte painting that says, translation is, "This is not a pipe." Most people know this, but it's actually very hard to maintain, when you're in conversation, for instance, a separation between the thing, the representation of the thing. I go to a museum and try to constantly say, representation of, or painting of, or sculpture of, every time you want to talk about something, and it's very tiring. And I think part of this leads to a whole lot of confusion within neuroscience and philosophy of mind too. But the idea that there's something to be analyzed in seeing, and that it isn't just sensing, comes up in this book, and it's a very important history, and people have been thinking about this for a long time. So around the time when, so the Arabs were the first to actually realize that seeing does not involve something going out of the eyes, but actually something entering, specifically light. It took a while for this to be realized. And I don't know whether that was actually Alhazen who wrote about it, but he made this point that nothing visible is understood by the sense of sight alone, save light and colors. And you could argue that what we know now means maybe not even those. But we kind of, in a way, regress from that point by the time we reach early modern philosophy, because this idea that all knowledge comes through the senses, like all of it, was very popular, and then became this thing that people had to argue against constantly, every generation. So through this debate, which is very condensed in this paragraph here, you kind of get to this idea that the sensory world is analyzed into sense data. And that kind of carries on. And then Helmholtz, by the 19th century, points out that, well, it's not just data, there's a type of inference going on. So unconscious inference now is very popular and hep because of the free energy principle, Bayesian brain, active inference world. That idea has been kicking around for quite a while. And you could argue that even Helmholtz didn't actually come up with it. He just sort of gave it a nice terminology, and people have probably been saying this for thousands of years in some form or the other.
If I can say, Alhazen actually discusses unconscious inference, and he uses the idea of unconscious inference to argue against direct realists.
Yeah, the direct realists always crawling out of the woodwork.
The direct realists of that time were the light comes out of the eye people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, awesome. So there's a continuum of process or phenomenon or experience, whatever you'd like to call it, and people attach different words to different parts of this and get very hung up on them. So on the one hand, there's pure sensation, allegedly pure sensation. Is this conscious or not? People debate to this day what that counts as, whether it's some sort of atoms of experience or not. And then through some processing, it can be parallel, it can be distributed, hierarchical, heterarchical. You get to something called declarative statements, propositions, such as I see an apple. So when you ask what someone sees, you typically you have to work with those declarative statements and sometimes other kinds of behaviors to infer what people see. So is there such a thing as pure sensation? What do you think the word sensation means? Is sensation conscious and in the first place? Because even that is debated. And given that we've been framing things in terms of top-down and bottom-up, how does top-down knowing, where we clearly know that at some point there's this thing called knowing, I know that's an apple, in what sense does that influence this bottom-up sensing? And here's an analogy, which I don't actually believe is correct, but it's something to throw out there, that the relationship between bottom-up and top-down is the relationship between seeing and seeing as. So you can argue, for instance, that there's this field of color and then there's a thing configuration, but when I recognize it as an apple, I'm seeing it as an apple. And that as part kind of enters into the experience. I don't think it aligns perfectly with these two ideas at all, actually, but it's something to keep in mind. And this is a big problematic, again, very debatable kind of topic. At what stage in this sequence, heterarchy, whatever you want to call it, does raw perception or pure or mediated, however you want to call it, perception, come to be the sort of thing to which words like true and false or veridical, illusory become applicable? When does a mental state become the type of thing to which you can say this is an illusion?
At no stage.
What?
At no stage is it veridical.
At no stage.
At no stage is it veridical.
But like if you see an apple and then you say it's an apple, is that not veridical?
It is veridical to the extent that you've made your knowledge to be that, right? So it's
that's what I mean.
Yeah, but it's presupposing the knowledge part, right? Like you're built on something. So it's not like the pure measure of something.
Oh, yes. Okay. I guess some people believe that there is such a thing as a pure truth that is beyond social convention that can be accessed in proposition form in an isolated human being. I don't know what that means, but I suppose someone might believe that. Okay, so just to construct a little straw man for us to play with. I like to think of the level 0 idea of what pure sensation is using this toy. I don't know what exactly it's called, pin toy, pin frame toy, something like that, where you push your hand or something through it and it produces an impression. I think this is the model of the reductionist idea of what a sense impression is, quite literally, something that pushes on individual sensors. These impressions, the transducers, they could be things on the retina, the ear, whatever you like. They're isolated. They're not like, each one is blissfully aware of the fact that they are even in a frame. And this is really not super relevant right now, but the responses are threshold linear. There's some minimum amount of pushing that you need in order to get it to move. And it's more or less linear for a while. And then it's, by virtue of being stuck in a frame, it won't respond any further. So this system doesn't get blinded, but you could break it. So that's another, so there's different impressions. And a lot of people, I think to this day, assume that there's something in the body that works like this. But in technology, things do kind of work this way. Does anyone know what this is?
The CCD for the camera.
Yeah. So there's I keep forgetting what CCD stands for. Charge coupled display or something like that, right? Charge coupled device. So that's kind of like the model of the pin frame, sort of. Although there will be a little light point spread even for these things if you pick the units too small. But this is something to keep in mind because as we get sophisticated, this will always kind of be something that we fall back on, even for something intermediate and deep inside the brain. And I'm not sure that you can actually completely dispense with it conceptually. So back to this Gombrich book. One way to approach the issue of the Gestalt, or the kind of all things hanging together in the visual field, is to think, how does something that's not just daubs of paint that you can see as daubs of paint when you're close up, how do they become a painting? So this Kenneth Clark, who I believe is the same Kenneth Clark who went on to make that famous documentary.
I think it's the Civilization guy.
Yeah. So he apparently, when looking at a great Velázquez painting, wanted to observe what went on when the brushstrokes and dabs of pigment on the canvas transformed themselves into a vision of transfigured reality as he stepped back. This is something you should do in a museum. It's great. Like, what I like to do is go up to one of those paintings that has a lot of paint on it. You can actually, when you stand obliquely, just see lumps of paint and then step back. And there's a moment of kind of pop out, depending on how large. The larger, the better. In fact, in our Emergence Journal Club, I proposed that maybe we were actually collecting a list of possible candidates for Emergence. And when I suggested it, we were all voting, and this got 0 votes. I was the only one who voted for this pop out as an emergent phenomenon. But I'm hoping that by the end of maybe this discussion series, I will convince more people that this is in fact an emergent phenomenon. So even the sense data idea has been criticized for a very long time. So within this art world, there are eloquent ways of putting this. Even the simplest sense impression that looks like merely the raw material for the operations of the mind is already a mental fact. Fact is a loaded word though, and what we call the external world is really the result of a complex psychological process. So there's been a lot of stuff written about this. There's a famous paper, I forget the title, but it talks about the myth of the given by Wilfred Sellers. Technical and complicated paper, but it's something that people keep talking about. Like, is there any raw material that we can take as given, but is mental as opposed to like physics? So this Gombrich book kind of talks about the influences on him, and he keeps talking about Gestalt psychology. So he mentions this book by Rudolf Arnheim, who was a psychologist, and he wrote a lot about art. So just in the last week, I downloaded this book and started reading it. It's fantastic, really well written. It's definitely from the perspective of an art critic or even an art teacher, but it has a lot that's kind of sets up what Steve's models are trying to do from a kind of different angle, which is why I thought it would be nice to bring this up. So it is generally admitted that the foundations of our present knowledge of visual perception were laid in the laboratories of the Gestalt psychologists. A lot of people might disagree even now, but I think that this is true. And my own development has been shaped by this. And he points out that the spirit underlying the reasons of these men, Wertheimer, Kohler, Kafka, the pioneers of Gestalt psychology, is very much at home with these artists. For them, the idea that a whole cannot be attained by the accretion of isolated parts was not something the artist had to be told. So by this time, if not even much earlier, the artist knew that there's something about perceiving that involves the whole thing, whole canvas, whole sculpture. It's an integrated structure, and perceiving it does not involve adding up little bits of anything. So for them, it was sort of preaching to the converted in a way. But it was nice for the Gestalt psychologists to make some of these things explicit. Because even to this day, a lot of people don't seem to understand what this idea really means. It's not actually that complicated. But I like to start with the etymology. So what is Gestalt? It means the quality of perceiving a complex organization of things or events as an organized whole, and also as more than the sum of the parts. So it's emergence in the phenomenal domain. And it comes from sort of an obsolete past participle of stand. And the word, one of the roots relates to, there's a Sanskrit word sthala, which kind of means the same thing, both standing and configuration. So it's a very old word, the root is very old. And so that's what that means. And it kind of aligns with something that Aristotle has said. In the case of all things that have several parts and in which the whole is not like a heap, but is a particular something beside the parts, there must be some such uniting factor. Some people think that this is magical thinking, but not really. Those factors can be as have been talked about in the emergence literature without adding any kind of magical element.
Johan, we were brief, besides the thing, because Kale and I, we were having a long argument before this stuff. This relates to the idea of compositionality too, right? So that's the whole point that they're trying to make. You can't simply make a case of like A plus B plus C or whatever is not the same as the composition of very many things put together, right? So it's sort of like also related to the notion of compositionality. And that is not just a question in art and phenomenology and all that stuff. It's also a very big question even within the field of math itself. It's not just a simple question that has been given like easy answers in any field. Even in math, it's an evolving concept as to what composition of something or some function or whatever that means. So yeah, I think it is also related to that.
Yeah, one thing that people who study kind of higher math will be more sort of sensitive to is the idea that the word sum has a very technical and specific meaning, even though we use that word all the time. So the feature of a sum is this, that once you identify parts, things to add, the sum of those things is unique. There's only one of them. And the order in which you perform the operation doesn't matter. That's the way that we understand how adding numbers works, just like integers or real numbers. But that's not the case for all kinds of combinations that you could imagine. There are domains of physics where all you need is linear interactions. So this sum concept generalizes to vectors, for instance. When you take a vector sum, it's a more complicated mathematical entity, but it doesn't matter what order you perform a vector sum in, which is why, even though you have these complicated n-body problems, you can simulate them just by taking each and every pairwise interaction and just summing them all, no matter what order you do that in. But there are plenty of situations where that's not true. You can come up with like any number of examples within even just physics and chemistry. So just to step out of the psychology word for a sec, configuration is really important even in physics and chemistry. Does anyone know what these things are? What are these diagrams of?
I will wait if no one knows.
Carbon formations?
Yeah, these are several
diamonds, graphite.
Yeah. So can you list them all? Well, C is a little hard, but I think the others you can name.
A diamond, B graphite.
Yeah.
And then D through F are buckyballs.
Yeah.
H is a nanotube. But what's G?
G is amorphous carbon, so it's like powdered charcoal, basically. C is something I hadn't heard of. Something starts with L, but if you just look at the Wikipedia page for allotropes of carbon, you'll see I hadn't really heard of it. And there are more. Does anyone know what graphene looks like?
B.
Yeah, it's just a single sheet of graphite. And you know how it was discovered? Somebody used sellotape on a piece of graphite and just ripped it off.
Duct tape is the greatest innovation for an experiment.
Yeah. So yeah, configuration is important. But specifically in the visual field, this book has an interesting way of justifying what a visual field is and why the word field is quite relevant. He starts with an example that may be more relevant to art, but it's a good kind of seg into what Grossberg does. So he asks the reader to look at this and say, is there something off about this? I think the answer is yes. At least for me, I could be like, oh, it's not centered. And when I make things in Adobe Illustrator, I'm extremely obsessive about aligning things. And I could even see when something is like 1 or 2 pixels off. So the question is, how do we know we're not doing explicit math? We do not establish sizes, distances, directions singly, and then compare them piece by piece. I think this is just a claim, but I think intuition is allowed for now. Typically, we see these characteristics as properties of the total visual field. I think in the case of balance, this is obvious. Even though balance in an aesthetic context is purely subjective, like people can disagree on whether a composition is balanced, you know that you're not using little rulers. And I like this point that he makes about the disc. There is something restless about it. And the question is, can we make that a little bit more specific? What do we mean? With that diagram, he says that all figures have a structural skeleton implicitly in the visual field, but you could say that it's in some subconscious thing that contributes to what you see. It's not quite the visual field, it's something else. And this diagram, it's not really said where this is happening or what this is, but the implication is that it's got something to do with the brain. I think earlier I said something about this isomorphism between things in the brain and mental experience. And here it's like not quite mental experience, but something that enables mental experience. So this idea of a visual field as a force field is much more specific than one might originally think. When people started to use the word field, they really were thinking of magnetic and electric fields. They were thinking that things in your visual field are not just like things in a field of grass that has no wind, just sitting and having no effect on each other. They push and pull at each other. They have all kinds of effects, like magnetic fields have on filings and things like that. So when the Gestalt psychologists used the word field, it was still very sort of kind of fashionable almost coming from the physics world, but it's not the case that it was just a gratuitous use of the word field. They had a specific mechanistic idea, even if the mechanism was not fleshed out. And so yeah, so I like a couple of things he says here. There are then more things in the field of vision than those that strike the retina of the eye. So clearly all these factors that influence whether you think something's balanced or some of the illusions that we'll talk about later are more than just consequences of light coming to the retina. And here he uses a term that I think is really useful for us now in 2021. Such perceptual inductions differ from logical inferences. I think this is quite handy, this word induction, because if you look at how Steve models it, there is no connotation of inference as like Sherlock Holmes inferring who did it, that kind of thing. The word inference comes loaded with all these symbolic meanings of like working on evidence and things like that. So even though people are now attributing inference to low-level neural processes, induction might be a better word. So Perceptual inductions are sometimes interpolations based on previously acquired knowledge. More typically, however, they are completions derived spontaneously during perception from the given configuration of the patterns. I was saying the other day that one difference between adaptive resonance theory and, say, active inference models is that many of the active inference models only have inhibition going from top to bottom. Whereas induction, by virtue of being an active sort of process of contributing something, is a better word for the kind of thing that we, or at least that I think is at least a useful way to think about positive, like excitatory effects. So I'm hoping people will start using it.
Johan, there is another way in which we can further aid both the speech story and the psychology story from beyond the Gestaltists, especially the last line that you said with respect to their completions deriving spontaneously during perception.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of exactly the pre-attentive processing part that Anne Treisman talks about in the creature integration theory too, right, of attention. So it's not like it's very, very different from the people who talk about active inference, where you have to suppose that all the evidence that is required is somehow already like sort of as a prior that is available for you. On the other hand,
they have ways of starting from uninformative priors.
Yes, I mean, I get it, but I'm
not really an issue, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think more interesting is the positive, the excitatory element, which I'd like to just keep following that thread wherever it comes up, because as I said before, positive feedback is hard to deal with. It's very badly behaved, just mathematically.
So hold on, a quick question for me. Do you think that this positive feedback is really inconsistent with reformulating this as something like an inference problem? I've been wondering as I look at the Steve stuff, whether this doesn't in some way map onto like a generative model that we can reformulate as inference. And is there reason to believe that we really can't do that?
It's the other way.
I don't think there's a strong reason. I think you can do it. I looked and I've been talking to you guys about this model, and I think I get part of the free energy math and the inference math, like the Rao and Ballard stuff. But a lot of work all the work is done by the inhibition. And you could say that the positive part of it is kind of creating the thing that performs the subtraction or the comparison. So there may be a way of formulating this where parts of that model do actually correspond to that. But I don't know how to do it. Like I could imagine it maybe, but I myself would not know where to start.
It seems like we at least wouldn't go as far as prediction error minimization. I think that by the time you get to that point, these two ideas have really diverged, and like that the idea of like eliminating all prediction error at each level, or like, yeah. In any case, I'll be thinking about that a lot moving forward.
Yeah, and if you have any ideas for how we can try and work it out if you like. So we could.
I'd be really interested to see if there's some way to turn this into a Bayesian brain model.
I won't be happy.
I have the opposite here conclusion here. I don't think I want to turn it into a Bayesian brain model. I think the Bayesian brain model is completely subsumed by models of such a dynamical systems rather the other way around.
Well, yeah, because Steve is not saying that there aren't types of feedback that are purely subtractive, and I think that's very useful in many places. Like doing the error cancellation is going to be definitely part of what any system is doing, and it may be that in certain more complicated hierarchical active inference models, particularly when you factor in time and working memory and stuff like that, you do actually have to have some sort of positive feedback. It's just that the way the math is formulated, because it's all based on probability distributions, inserting positive feedback, there's no obvious way to do it, because then the interpretation as a probability becomes difficult. Not impossible, but a little difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense as an important distinction. You would have to navigate that before trying to put them into the same language.
But there's ways to do it as long as you have really good normalization, which again, Steve has a way of doing that, but so it's not impossible. So bookmark that. So again, another phrase in the Arnheim book I really liked: seeing is the perception of action. And hopefully I'll link this with something more brain-centric later. So this visual field is a dynamic landscape in which lines are actually ridges sloping off in both directions. This is a nice link with the dynamical system stuff that we've been talking about for a while. Although, since it's a psychology for art book, it's vague. We don't know what this landscape is, where it resides, and what exactly the lines and ridges are. But basically, the intuition is that there's lines of influence between the things that you see, or in a sense, causing the things that you see. Right, so here he makes a point: no point in the figure is free from this influence. Granted, there are restful spots, but their restfulness does not signify the absence of active forces. Dead center is not dead. The general idea here, I think, is a version of something that psychologists have been strongly influenced by since the 19th century, which is they weren't thinking of dissipative systems. They were thinking of conservative systems where the only form of stationarity you can get is when all forces are counterbalanced. With dissipative systems, we have this whole other way of talking, attractors and stuff like that. So you don't have to cancel out forces necessarily to get stationary perception in this case. But maybe that's a quibble, but I think it's just sometimes the analogy with physics forces can lead you in a slightly misleading direction. But towards the end, I like this. The life of a percept, its expression and meaning, derives entirely from the activity of the perceptual forces. Any line drawn on a sheet of paper, simplest form modeled from a piece of clay, is like a rock thrown in a pond. It upsets repose. It mobilizes space. Seeing is the perception of action. That's beautiful. Because for me, throwing away the more physicsy kind of version, these forces are inhibition and excitation, basically. And a few other things, neuromodulation, but that's what these forces are in a suitably chosen neural model. So yes, I've said this. As I see it, Grossberg's research program is to take these types of metaphors that have been kicking around for a while and make them neurobiologically plausible. This is this word that we use a lot in our papers because it's not the case that everybody thinks that they are plausible. Some people think they are, and other people just don't really understand them. But I think they're neurobiologically plausible.
So I think, Johan, one sort of complication of this that needs to be considered is that when we're thinking about percepts, and especially sequences of percepts that we get out of active sensing and eye movements, because we have to remember we're not passive observers. We are actively deciding where to move our eyes to sample even a static painting. That there are parts of the brain that want to get rid of hysteresis, and there are parts of the brain that hysteresis cannot be gotten rid of, and that these really modulate our perceptions if the area of the brain or the network in the brain that is doing the computation is vulnerable to hysteresis or not.
That's a great point. I have to think about it more, but I really like that because it's, I mean, just first pass, 100% true. There are things where for no amount of effort can cause you to clear certain things from what Steve calls the short-term memory. Whereas other things, a new event, a distraction of some sort can quite effectively clear it or mask it, as the case may be. That's a really good point. Okay, so how might we take our toy model of reductionist perception and turn it into a field of forces? Any suggestions? What would you do specifically to this thing?
Constrain it by a map.
Maybe more physical.
How about five rubber bands between every little pin to every other pin?
Just
something
adjacent pins.
Yes.
Oh, the balls on strings. Yeah, there we go.
So people will not be surprised that my background is physics. But so the reason I brought this up is that distance-dependent networks are like that, but way more complicated because we don't assume that our neurons just have nearest neighbor interactions. That grid looks nice and clean because there's only pairwise interactions with nearest neighbors. Whereas neural networks have all these long, medium and long range interactions, which is why it's a nightmare to draw even a schematic figure for a complicated neural network. Like sometimes I have my simulation ready to go and I have to explain what I've done to collaborators. And I was like, oh no, now I have to draw a diagram. And how am I going to do this? Like, so the springs are of various weird sorts. They can be non-Newtonian and pull when they're pushed and push when they're pulled, all kinds of weird stuff like that. All these weird currents, low threshold calcium and inactivation sensitive potassium. There's all these different sorts of springs acting on the membrane. So a thing to keep in mind is that we are being vague about the units. Am I talking about single neurons, groups of neurons? How you decide to model these pairwise interactions will depend on the units that you choose. Is it a column? Is a column even a real thing? There's all these questions you can ask. So Steve motivates this chapter by getting into the topic of boundaries. But he talks mostly about art and illusion. So you might think, well, what are boundaries? Do we even need them? And he doesn't get into the ethology and ecology too much. Maybe he will later. But he has mentioned it in the past. But basically, imagine that a complex scene. There's lots and lots of rich data. And knowing where things are, even as they're moving, does involve segmenting them very successfully. One point that Steve makes, which he doesn't make in this chapter for some reason, is that knowing where the outline of an object is can help you keep track of it when it goes behind something else. So for instance, the prey is gone behind a tree. It does not disappear from your awareness. You know kind of where it is, and you can use that awareness to plan out subsequent movements. Insufficiently advanced, evolved predators. So segmenting, particularly in complex environments, is really important. But the amount of information you have to segment using just light might not be sufficient. There may be lots and lots of dappling and complicated sources of light, shadow, and changes in these things because of changes in sunlight, clouds, all kinds of things. So Steve wants us to think about invisible boundaries. And he sets up an opposition between seeing and recognizing. So on the left is the Ehrenstein, a simple version of that. And if you do see the floating or the slight brightness, whatever you want to call it, there's something there. There's some quality to it that you do see, or it seems like seeing to me. It doesn't just seem like a guess, if you like, or a hunch. Whereas on the right, you're not seeing, but you're recognizing. So what are you recognizing? A line. It's clear that you see a line, or at least I think it is, that one tends to see a line and recognize that there is an alignment, but you don't actually see it. So that is an interesting thing to place in the debate about seeing and knowing. And for Steve, the recognizing part is kind of the low-level version of the seeing, of knowing. So Steve actually talks about qualia in this chapter and kind of decides to disagree with John Searle, I think. So is there something it is like to perceive or recognize invisible boundaries, another amodal percept? So amodal means not belonging to any modality. Steve uses it in a more technical kind of way to include things within the visual domain that don't actually correspond to what we would think of as actual visual signals. There's something else. They're amodal. So Grossberg seems to think the answer is no, that those things do not come with any qualia attached. I don't actually think this argument flies, which he has in this paragraph. Even though I think maybe he thinks it aligns with the definition of qualia in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's something it is like for me to undergo each state, some phenomenology that it has. This is called qualia. It is not the case, for me at least, that there is nothing it is like to see an invisible boundary. I think there is something it is like. So I don't really buy this. But he wants to call them percepts that have no qualia. He does kind of anticipate my criticism. So one way out of this problem is to define qualia to be essentially equivalent with every conscious experience, which is maybe what I was doing. The rest of the book avoids such a convention when using words like seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing, by writing clearly about the phenomena that are included, which is fair. So this relates to his key questions. Why do we see? We see in order to recognize, fair enough. And we can recognize things such as that offset grating without seeing them. Everything has to have scare quotes now. Let's move on. So I like this illusion a lot, actually. I don't know whether I had actually seen it before. He uses this to argue for this idea that all boundaries are invisible, which you might think, well, I agree, Steve, that some boundaries are invisible, but really all. His reasoning is he kind of bolts it to this example, but there's an interesting kind of story to tell you. So the boundaries of the circle alternate between dark to light and light to dark. So the contrast keeps flipping. It's not the same contrast as you go around the circle, and same is true here. The boundary computation appears to be invariant to the contrast direction, or polarity, he calls it. Now, what does this technical and sort of obscure sounding fact have to do with anything, you might ask? This is what Steve's reasoning is. If the brain adds together these signals, so basically his idea is that the way that to construct this polarity invariant kind of sensitivity is to just add them together, sum them. But if that's the case, then these boundaries that are constructed cannot tell the difference between light and dark. It's a very interesting point. And they cannot carry a visible signal of lightness or darkness. So this relates in a way to what he thinks a qualia is. So you're constructing something which you used to see, as we'll get to, but you don't actually see it because it actually doesn't contain any visual information in the normal sense of light and contrast. A way that you could elaborate on this idea is that when you talk about actual visible boundaries, what you're actually talking about are actually patches, like things that have an inner and outer boundary. Like if you take a thick marker and draw something, the black of the thick marker has two boundaries, and those things are invisible. So it's something to chew on. I don't know whether I completely get it necessarily, but I think that's his way of thinking. Karthik?
Yeah, but when we go later, I think from the next chapter, he'll make that very clear. While boundaries are invisible, there is something called as a boundary contour, which is kind of what you are seeing. It's not necessarily the boundary itself. The other way to motivate is also partially ecological or ethological, which he probably has not shown because there's a chapter about art and all that, is that if you just suppose that two objects actually have clear boundaries that you are able to see, then where does that boundary go when you occlude one object from the other and you partially don't see parts of the boundary of that object, right? So you still are able to see the ownership of this object belonging to one or the other, right? So you can also make an equivalent argument from the ethological side, motivated by occlusion or the scene that you showed with the tiger and the trees and all that stuff too. So I don't think it needs to be, while this is a very strong motivator from illusions, you can do the same thing with respect to occlusions and all that stuff too, where why he thinks boundaries are all invisible, while it's all the surface that you perceive. Nico.
I just wanted to elaborate on that, which is that the occlusion thing is obviously very important, but also that the boundaries have to exist. So, for example, one of the big changes between Steve's earlier work and the work that I did with him is whether attention spreads along boundaries or attention spreads along surfaces. And I think psychophysically, the evidence is extremely strong that it spreads along surfaces. And my paper with him was the first paper that we moved where the attention was spreading. And the thing is that to have a surface, it has to be contained, whether it's visible or not. And people like Ken Nakayama and John Driver showed very carefully that attention spreads on occluded surfaces, so in 3D. These are very weird experiments. Okay. And so that there has to be this thing, a representation of a boundary that you cannot see because you're seeing the thing in front of it, or you would have a very different visual system where the occluded tiger and the brush would have an outline that you would perceive. Even though you couldn't see chunks of the tiger.
Yeah. So there's a little point here which is not relevant to the arguments he's mainly making, but this is related to one of the arguments against memory being the only thing that conditions your top-down bias. So most people have experienced checkerboards, but in this illusion, many people, I definitely get a strong version of this. You tend to see a circle on top of a plus sign that's on a big square for both of those. I see that anyway. And for me, it's a very strong effect. It may not work for everybody, but I have never seen a chessboard that looks like that. So why would that happen? The argument here is that there are certain kind of generic processes that have to do with just how the visual system deals with orientation and contrast and depth order that make it seem like there are three things in relative depth order. So circle on a plus sign on a large square. It may seem like a lot to infer from just an illusion, but you could cash this out as like what Nico was saying about in 3D situations wanting to maintain depth order and knowledge about what's behind what. It sort of relates to that, which we'll get to, I think.
Just a further resource for people who are interested in this beyond going to Ken Nakayama and John Driver's classical work is Pawan Sinha's Project Prakash, which is a program where India is one of the few places in the world where there are a lot of people that don't get congenital cataracts removed very early on in their life. So there's a whole bunch of people who even reach adulthood with congenital cataracts. And Project Prakash goes in and provides free cataract surgery. And it's a very cheap surgery to do, and it's a very simple surgery to do. And then for the people who are interested in it, they do longitudinal follow-up analysis on people who are between the ages of, say, 6 and 25 who get the surgery, and how they recover vision, and when they can see occlusions, when they can, this is people who are old enough to report what they're seeing, and how over time the types of things that they see and whether they can tell, for example, whether something is in front of something else and when that occurs. And they have a really great set of papers about that, which if you're interested in this topic, I would highly recommend.
That line of research actually answered what they call the philosophical question, is like, would someone who recognizes a circle or a square just based on somatic, like tactile information, recognize one when they just see it? And the answer was no. They actually needed an experience to bind their tactile information to the visual information. But just one experience, I think, pretty quick to form the cross-modal analogy, let's call it that. Okay, so we just talked about this actually, but the brightness that we've seen in these illusions, Steve would argue, or argues that it's a clue to the depth of the apparent things that whose boundaries you're constructing. Here, these four things are versions of this illusion are basically showing that you can strengthen the sense of depth order, as in this lower left one, or you can weaken it. Like here, the square for the top right, you do see a kind of square, but the filling in that produces something of a floating quality is quite weak. Whereas here, what's interesting is that you'd think that these vertical sort of things going on top of the boundary would break the illusion. But if anything, it strengthens it, and it just seems like there's a sort of thing again on top of the square. So if you don't see it, it's an illusion. Not everybody can necessarily get that effect. I think And again, he could have made this argument here. I don't know why he hasn't. There could be a kind of physics way to think about this in terms of illumination and depth. Like when you have a source of illumination, how that falls off with things that are further from you. I think that he probably has that in mind. He just didn't mention it here. So just as another somewhat ethological answer to this, so to one of those sort of technical issues, why would we need to throw away the specific contrast of an edge or a boundary in the first place? And you could say from the perspective of a predator, when you have all these creatures using camouflage, as long as it moves, you're actually getting quite a bit of information from those alternating changes from light to dark, dark to light. So maintaining a boundary representation that throws away that information is pretty, I think, adaptive. But there's a kind of adversarial situation here because animals use counter shading to throw off the boundary completion systems of predators. There's apparently some debate about what exactly counter shading does and is it in fact a selected trait. So it's not like this is a definitive case. But here you see in arguments, this is from Wikipedia, arguments about natural light, how shadows form, and why counter shading kind of disrupts what you might expect from natural lighting of a uniformly shaded object. It's a lot to kind of get into there, but that's one way to think about, in this particular arms race, throwing away the specific contrast direction might be pretty useful. Okay. The other sort of thing that he does talk about is that the boundaries that we see are constructed.
Sorry, just one more historical comment. I put it into the chat, but if you don't know what dazzle camouflage is,
I don't.
So it was a paint scheme that was used by the US and the British during World War II, which had high contrast, weird geometric shapes to try to make it so that U-boat commanders who were looking out of a monocular periscope couldn't tell how far the ship was away from them or what the ship was.
Huh. Did it work?
A mixed success.
You know what it reminds me of? There's this story where Pablo Picasso and Gertrude Stein, I believe, were passing by a tank painted in camouflage, and Picasso says to Gertrude Stein, "We did that." The meaning the painters, the modern artists. Okay, so one point that Steve makes about boundaries and why it needs a fair amount of infrastructure is that it's constructed from spotty sense data. Put sense data in scare quotes, but I think most of you know about the blind spot. There's a, like where where 3 is, there are no receptors there for light. So there's this huge blind spot. You can actually see it. I forget how far you have to hold something, but you can find your own blind spot. And so if you look at the light response pattern, what?
About 8 inches for the normal test.
Yeah. So you can see from this response pattern that outside the fovea there's this notch where you're not getting any light information. So in addition to that source of potential problem, there's the veins on the retina, the blood vessels which can actually produce shadows on the retina, which apparently you can see if you shine a torch at a certain angle. I have not tried it. Apparently,
it's a great way to see the blood vessels in your eye. If you make a pinhole, either in a piece of paper or with your fingers, look through the pinhole at the sky or a bright white wall, and then you wiggle the pinhole in front of your eye, one eye, you can actually see all your vasculature and your fovea as well. It's incredible. I highly recommend it.
Or you can be as stupid as me and like stare at the sun for a few seconds and do it.
Do not do that.
Don't do that.
I said I qualified it by saying stupid. So
that's Isaac Newton's preferred way.
Didn't he also press a dagger on his eye?
Yeah. He put a needle. He punctured his cornea.
Not recommended. So one response is that, well, the eyes are constantly moving. There's saccades and microsaccades. So maybe you could just blur out your blind spot. Steve thinks that that's not really sufficient. This is from probably the Yarbus studies, which we'll probably talk about at some point. But yeah, you could, by sampling in a clever way, you could sort of compensate for the fact that you have a blind spot. And Steve argues that that's not enough. I don't know whether his argument is adequate, but that's his argument, that this jiggling of the eyes isn't enough to compensate for this loss of information. So he imagines a situation where you have a straight edge, but the blind spot and retinal veins are not providing any information, or they're stabilized. So there's anything that's stabilized with respect to movement disappears, as we talked about. But disappearing is not the same as actually seeing something positive in a particular place.
So the reason why microsaccade will not be enough is because if you look at the total width of the blind spot, it is actually much greater than what you would consider a microsaccade itself.
Aha. No, so, why couldn't he have said that in this paragraph? Anyway, yeah. So there's some reasoning that you need, that you'll still have holes that haven't been stabilized. And so this is his, I redrew this diagram, but his idea that across the holes, there's a kind of active process, field lines that fill in at the boundary that you see, and that's the math for that we'll eventually look at. So what does the visual system do with boundaries? It creates surfaces. So there's a complementary set of processes here. The boundary completion he describes as inward. I don't know whether inward is a very good term. Why does he call it inward, Karthik?
I think, I don't know exactly, but I think it has got to do with the fact that it is oriented, right? Isn't that the reason why?
Yeah, it says inward and oriented.
Because
So this gets into a lot of the research that Arash Yazdanbakhsh has done. So I mean, the original physiological intuition is that why on earth do you have end-stop cells in V1? And, one of the reasons that you might have them is that you don't want boundaries to go on indefinitely, because then you can't bind them to other boundaries to create a pool that can be filled by the surface. Yeah. So if you have, so this gets into, and I'm sure we'll discuss the competitive cooperative loop in some detail later on. But the basic idea is that unless you have a matching signal to connect to far away, then the local boundary signal might be veridical and it might not be. But if you have another signal to connect it to, yeah, then you have a lot more evidence that indeed this is a boundary, even if it's an occluded boundary.
So there's some kind of synergy where there's these feelers that are put out by candidate boundaries, basically. And that's sort of inward. But I think the main reason it fits is because the filling in part is outward. So you have a bunch of features, and think of it like the system, this neural structure that's creating boundaries. It's creating a kind of bucket in which the feature can sort of leak out. And the boundaries sort of adjust how far it can go. I think so. Do you guys get the neon color spreading effect? The white inside is the same color as the.
Are we ever gonna get into Gennadi's work that shows when the boundaries fail and the features leak across them?
Oh, I couldn't find. Maybe next time I'll find that, because I know Marge used to give those awesome animated things where the color would leak out. It's just fantastic. But well, if anyone knows where to find those things, demos, just point them to me.
There's also the Todd Hay version where you can do that for even cheaper.
Oh, right.
Close the boundaries and start leaking out. We can, yeah.
That's Eric Schwartz's work though, so we'll have to bookmark that too.
Yeah, but by the way, are we ever I don't want to, get ahead of it, but are we ever going to have an extensive discussion about log polar actual visual geometry and the effects that have on our perception?
Maybe we should, but I'm not sure where. I can maybe insert it next time, because next chapter is also vision, right?
Because it's really important in how that interacts with saccades and the veins and the blind spot and everything else. You know, it's you know, as Eric's main critique about Steve's picture of early vision is that it's far too static.
Part to Cartesian as well.
Yeah,
so,
and I agree completely.
And you know, my work and Arash Fazl's work is non-Cartesian, but he got to that very late conceptually.
Right. So yeah, all these are like, you know, terms in this infinite series, and whether we can complete that series is, or even extend it, is still an open question. So there's a kind of yin-yang interaction. This is the kind of idea that they're not separate. They're things that influence each other.
Johan, before we
boundaries and contours.
Before we go into
surfaces,
maybe we should just explain a bit further for those who are unaware. What we mean by a log polar map is that it's sort of like we labor under the illusion, again, we should use that word, it's a good word to use. We labor under the illusion that what we look at in the world is sort of flat and in sort of Cartesian or Euclidean in a sense. But if you look at the actual way in which, you know, the visual field is projected or the visual field is shaped, it's nowhere close to like, you know, all objects in the visual field are given equal valence or something like that. It's sort of like there is an eccentricity that extends from your foveal area to parafoveal to your periphery. So the size kind of scales up and it's also kind of distorted. So at any given moment, whatever you're looking at is a very distorted map, but somehow we get the perception that it's sort of like all beautiful, clean, flat.
It's really, really complicated. But here's my metaphor for this, that there's a kind of funhouse mirror kind of thing happening with V1. Like if you were to take which parts of V1 are sensitive to which parts of the visual field, you'll have a wildly overrepresented fovea, and then this much less territory given to the parafoveal and peripheral. So if you were to take V1 activity and stretch it out on a flat surface, you'd get this much more very warped kind of picture from which to infer what the person is looking at. So we talked about boundaries, and so here we get into Steve's work with Bengio Pina. It's actually the artist who made it, and Steve actually wrote a paper about this with him, where the boundaries constrain the filling in, as we've seen with the neon color spreading. But there's an interesting thing here where boundaries can actually compete with each other. So here, the percept that you may get is that some of these cloud-like things seem to sort of pop out and be a little bit 3D and sort of bulge out. And the argument,
also have a bluish shade,
and may have a bluish tinge. For me, that was weak, but what you can and the argument here is that the strong contrast dark blue is competing with the weaker contrast light blue and kind of pushing that to be the direction in which the filling in takes place. So we'll get into that. So basically, whichever neural representation you come up with, some version of competition may be happening, and that may correspond to certain phenomena and maybe even to certain illusions. And this I thought was interesting, that in more complicated situations, not all boundaries are spatially separated. So in response to more interesting objects, you have a form-sensitive boundary web that fits itself statistics of the shading and texture. So now we get to, okay, here's where Bayesian, whatever learning you want to call it, where that starts to have to come in. And here's where Steve talks about hierarchical versions of these ideas, but I think we have to devote separate sort of time to that way of thinking. But because getting this basic mechanism in place is more important than stacking these things on top of each other. But the basic idea is that when you have candidate boundaries at different spatial scales, the hierarchy in the visual system is kind of doing an all of the above approach, which is computing boundaries at one level, and then at a more coarse-grained level, and so the receptive fields increase as you go up the visual hierarchy. So you have boundaries at various scales. So this
this boundary webs idea for Steve, initially he was only thinking about it at local stuff and then spatial scales. This boundary webs work was actually more motivated from the work of the great Jacob Beck and Slava Prajny, if I remember correctly. Nico can correct me on this, but it was Jacob Beck, who I think he was there at BU for a sabbatical or something during the time when Steve and Ennio were working on these problems. That's when he showed them a bunch of his beautiful texture patterns and research work that he had done on texture psychophysics. And that's where, like, I think Steve kind of hit upon this idea that you should not be too restrictive in the way in which you kind of define what constitutes a boundary and the scale at which you constitute it.
Yeah, so this was definitely Beck stuff. Just historically, if I remember, it wasn't a sabbatical. He sort of retired to be an emeritus member of the CNS faculty, which is why he left all of his books.
All his books were there, yeah.
To CNS. But the issue about texture here is very important, and texture goes in one direction. From big to large, from low spatial frequency to high spatial frequency, a more precise way of saying that, which is, as Ennio liked to point out with one of his slides, how do water buffalo become a pattern? And he had this picture of this gigantic herd of, thousands and thousands of water buffalo taken from a distance away. And yeah, they're a texture. But when you think of a water buffalo, you don't think of an element of a texture. And so and this has physiological backing. So Moshe Bar, among other people, I think he was the first person to show this, demonstrated that there is a magnocellular fast shot from primary visual cortex into orbital frontal cortex and down into, and then feeding back into IT cortex, which does object recognition. And that gets there just before the parvocellular information that does the high spatial frequencies gets to IT. And so this is, a physiological possible underpinning of the idea that you start with the low spatial frequency segmentation of the environment. So for example, I think the more recent stuff about this that I thought was really, really impressive was done by Tren and the artsy model, where you start with big segment, low spatial frequency segmentation, and then you iteratively downsample the spatial frequencies you look at, so you can pick out texture patches, even though the boundaries within those texture areas can be very, very complicated. And so as long as you prime the system correctly, all of this falls out. And it's not done simultaneously. It's done at all levels of spatial frequency. But the actual temporal sequence that it occurs and where you get resonance first and where you get resonance later matters.
Yeah, so basically it's like starting with a fuzzy, blurred picture and zooming in.
Yeah.
So there wasn't any good diagram, so I thought...
We also use the word gist. It's the gist,
yeah.
the gist, and then we go down, yeah.
But the boundary web idea doesn't have to just be focused on that. So in an image like this, the famous Raphael-esque head exploding by Salvador Dali, there are different ways you can sort of parse this image, right? You can think of the face, the head, or you can think of it like the sort of looking upwards at the dome. And when you sort of shift between the different possible interpretations, there are different things that you're treating as boundaries with which to sort of make an object representation. So you could be thinking about the boundaries that align with the head. You could be drawing boundaries. In a sense, we're making all these boundaries, but which one we're maybe paying more attention to can vary. And all of them are kind of candidates that kind of go out. And if they kind of resonate with other things happening in other parts of the visual field, you get boundary completion. And this idea reminded me of something. So does anyone know what this A to B diagram is, or where it might have come from? It's from the path integral formulation in physics. So some of you may have heard of this idea in physics called action minimization, technically action maximalization. So there's this idea that from the 19th century that you can define this quantity called the action, and then the minimum of that gives you the equations of motion of some system. And one way to formulate that is that you fix the start and end point of some system, and you look at all possible paths between them, and whichever path minimizes this quantity called the action is the one that the system takes. So you clamp the beginning and the end. And in quantum mechanics, the beginning and the end, or the end especially, is not clamped. But the image I had is of, in the case of the brain, trying out a bunch of different systems in kind of, here in this case, it's not in time. A and B are not different points in time, but different points in space. And they kind of, whichever one optimizes some constraint is the boundary that you pick. And that constraint could involve your attention or some top-down goal or something like that. So
yeah, the interpretation of that I find really fun from quantum or from physics is that all of those paths can be interfering with each other, and the interference pattern that emerges, like they all interfere away except for the ones that minimize. And that almost makes sense in a visual field. I don't know if
100%. So
yeah.
But maybe incorporating more of the visual field and the behavioral and planning parts. So I like to think of that exact analogy, which is the only time I would want to link quantum ideas with the brain is in this, which is, you have to be really careful because we're not talking about anything magical or anything with quantum weirdness. It's just the idea that multiple representations, for lack of a better term, multiple patterns that fit with some set of constraints can all interfere with each other. And you in some sense are perceiving all of them. And based on what you need to be doing or where your attention is, you can actually shift which of them is most sort of present to you. And that's an interesting way of thinking about even that simple thing of moving your attention while keeping your eyes fixed. But in a hierarchical system, like, how Dennett has this idea of multiple drafts? I think of these as those drafts, but they're all there, and we can kind of voluntarily move among them in some way. And it's a very vague idea, but I think there's some reason that there's mathematical clothes that you could put on it.
I would just like to say, totally unrelated to the current discussion, that one interpretation of quantum mechanics is that it is basic probability theory on complex numbers.
Is this related to Cubism? Quantum Bayesianism?
It relates. It's maybe not. It's adjacent.
Okay. So the hierarchical idea has been mapped onto a neural structure that many of you will be familiar with, the what pathway and the where pathway. The where pathway is the dorsal pathway, and the what pathway is the ventral pathway. There's some disagreement and debate about what exactly this is and whether it's right, but here's something from Wikipedia. There's these different functions that each stream of the visual system seems to be involved in. The what system seems to be involved in recognition, it's high spatial frequency, it's slow, which you can kind of map onto the fact that high spatial frequency means a lot of detail. So telling apart the poisonous mushroom from the not so poisonous one, it requires some deliberation. You can't do it when you're in a tearing hurry. And the rest of this stuff, you take it or leave it. And the dorsal system, visually guided, high temporal frequency, relatively fast, motion sensitive. And that's widely talked about. Steve has a particular way of interpreting that. And we'll talk about this. I'm just showing this diagram because that's how he thinks about this. But the most important thing to take away from this is the idea that these separate streams are constantly interacting with each other, that they're not just separate modules, because he makes this point. In fact, Karthik, I don't know whether you read this, but on page 97, he contrasts his perspective with Marge Livingston and David Hubel's idea, where he said, they talk about color versus orientation processing and things like that. And he says that there are different predictions, but he doesn't actually say what sorts of neural data would definitively, rule out their model and rule in his, or vice versa. So have you thought about that?
So the issue for Steve is, okay, not Steve. Okay, let's go with the neurophysiologist worldview, right? Like, what do someone like Livingston or Hubel and others from the vision world do? We stick an electrode in some brain area, make an animal do a particular task, and see what aspects of the stimulus are correlated. That used to be the start of the field, and that's how we came with the idea that V1 responds to orientation or end-stop cells, complex or simple or whatever. And then once you go to V2, you have your thick blobs and thin blobs and interstripes, and I mean you have the figure here. So whether they're responding to color versus disparity versus so for the Hubel-Wiesel kind of worldview, they are basically these early visual areas are sort of like multiplexing different featural representations, and whatever is the area which binds them kind of like binds them together. So that's their general worldview. So the binding happens at the very end, depending on which information is most relevant or not. Steve, while he agrees with them on the neurophysiology of like, this neuron is more responsive to color versus disparity or whatever, doesn't really buy that multiplexing necessarily. He thinks that there are interactive effects between these different features at different levels that are, and between the what and the where pathway, if you're going to use them in that narrow sense, that are extremely crucial for both recognizing and guiding your behavior based on recognizing that object. So for him, it's not, they are never going to be the parallel streams in the truest sense. So that's where I would say most of the differences between them comes up. And I think he's right about it, because it's sort of like, it's quite arbitrary in the sense of what are all the features that you want to see reflected in V1 or V2 or whatever. And then it's an entirely open question then as to how you're going to bind all of them to give you that percept, right? Like I can arbitrarily put four of those 5 features, or 3 of those 5 features, or n of those m features to give you the percept. So there is a complete arbitrariness to their worldview when it comes to like binding those parallelly multiplexed representations, and he's not having any of it. So that's a simpler way to summarize what he does. But yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, given that this was basically my thesis, the basic thing that he disagrees on with this is, okay, so first of all, we're moving our eyes around all the time, and we're moving our eyes around in this log polar universe where an edge that looks like this when you're looking right at it might look like this when you are looking at another part of the object, and you have to associate and bind those boundaries together. And that when you're thinking about it in this sort of active pathway system, active sensation system, and the where stream certainly is controlling where we look next. There are very few signals for orienting to the next saccade in temporal cortex. So, although, by the way, I'm looking for them right now. But so definitely the where stream, but the where stream has to make these things. I mean, we saccade every 250 milliseconds. So, the where stream is having to decide where we make our next saccade, way before, especially for complex objects, we're perceiving them, which, we usually have to make 3 or 4 saccades. So it's like a second to get. And so there have to be multiple levels at which where and what work together to bind objects as view invariant surfaces. So as we're moving our eyes around, we know we're on the same surface, or we could make an identical eye movement in terms of length, saccade in terms of length, and wind up on a different surface. And we don't want to conflate those surfaces. And one area that could do this is V4 has some signals that look like this, which is not totally inconsistent with the Hubel-Livingstone idea. But we're now finding more and more mutual information between areas like the superior temporal sulcus and, or in humans, the temporal parietal junction, and the dorsal attention network, or the where stream. And it really seems like they're, they talk to each other several times.
So I guess maybe one way to say it is that this crosstalk is a way of constraining things, so that things are not just sort of flying off on their own.
Yeah, I mean, one of the classic Steve views of complementarity of coding which is to say, which I'm sure Johan will go on and define more rigorously later. But complementary coding are systems that have to lose information about one aspect of the signal to gain more precise information about the other aspect of the signal. And so the earliest area in which the earliest two areas that are definitely doing complementary encoding are MT and V4. So V4 has very precise positional information about where an edge is, but has very bad information about whether it's moving and if it's moving, in what direction it's moving. Where area MT has very good information about whether an edge is moving and in what direction it's moving, but very poor positional information.
So this relates to what I'm about to show. I'm hoping I don't want to keep people too long, but I have some fun points to make towards the end, which I hope you'll stick around for. So, we just talked about that. So Paul Chisek, when he spoke to us, a few months ago, he like talked about something that he had a better figure than this one, which is an older one that he did, but where he talked about affordances. We talked about this the wear stream in terms of graspability and grasping. So on the sensory side, you may have a kind of affordance being represented and the actual action on the motor side of that particular transition along this dorsal stream. So this is has a very sort of interesting, it can lead to some interesting questions. So why would the boundary processing stream, to kind of caricature it, why is that stream the action stream? What is it about boundaries that makes them so conducive to action? And what implications does this have for art? I have some vague ideas, so I'm just sort of going to gesture vaguely at them, but I think some of you know what I'm thinking of. But that.
Have you ever encountered a knife?
So, well, I don't know what. So the sharp parts are what you have to keep track of. The edges and outlines for chasing after things or running away from things, basically. So maybe I'll skip this for now. We'll come to it later. But Grossberg makes this point about complementarity being different from modularity, and we sort of touched it, but I'm going to skip it for now because we'll come back. And I don't think he made the case adequately in this section anyway. So here's the question I want. And many people have asked, why do people draw edges that don't exist? Like if you look at your visual field, you're not going to see these black lines that people typically draw, right? In comics and manga and whatever. But if you look, maybe they don't use black lines, but look at this Egyptian art, this Mayan art. Clearly outlines are being drawn with a dark ink. Why? Greeks were doing it too. So that's a question, right? And a related question, why do children draw the way they do? Put an asterisk because, not all children, some children don't draw these kind of schematics. It's not the same answer necessarily as this, but some people in some of these older books were not so politically correct. They're like, why do primitive peoples and children draw the same way? and so it's a good question. Like, what is it about edges that seems to command our action system? That's the way I like to ask the question. That why is that type of information so close to my hands? Like there's a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. The neuroscience part I would recommend ignoring, but there's a very interesting advice it gives. And it starts by motivating you in the following way. It says, well, anybody who can write down their own name has enough motor control to draw well. So drawing does not involve some skill in the hands or in the motor cortex. It's in the way of seeing. And to put more flesh on that, the way of seeing is a way of acting and giving your hands access to information which is actually in your brain, but in a sense, but it's sort of kept away from the motor system for some reason, which, I'm not proposing an answer to that, but I think it's related to this, what Nico said about knives. So here's where you can
I just want to say, if you go back a slide, I don't know whether you did this consciously or unconsciously, but you actually picked an almost perfect picture on the right, because the sun doesn't have a drawn edge, the flowers don't have a drawn edge, the tree doesn't have a drawn edge, but everything that you could run into except the tree trunk has a drawn edge.
Did not notice that, but that's great. I'm a little suspicious when I look in Google Images for children's drawings, because sometimes they're just drawn by adults to look like children's drawings. But I'm pretty sure the one on the left is. So you can ask the question now in the art history context, what was so new? What were they up to? What did they discover? When you zoom in, you can kind of see it, what they're doing or what they're not doing that so many other types of drawing seem to do. Well, they're basically not drawing. They're placing sections of what you might call surfaces in one sense, like they're blobs of features that, and you actually construct the contours from your visual system. So you don't even need the lines because you're going to make them anyway. You will see with them. And so Steve talks about that in this context. So what was the discovery? What was Matisse in this painting coming up with? It's this idea that, well, because there's a long tradition in the West of, first you draw the outlines and then you paint on top of them or with them. But here, these people were saying paint directly in color. And if you provide sufficient contrast in the surfaces, the edges will be computed for you, for the artist. So it's sort of a given. And another interesting motivation which Steve talks about is that if you can get rid of some of the dark outlines which people draw, you can avoid color assimilation. So color assimilation can happen when the dark is placed next to the lighter color. The color can seem darker by proximity. This is quirky and needs to be, you have to be careful about it because you can actually get the opposite effect depending on the spatial relationship. You can enhance contrast or get assimilation depending on the spatial frequency at which these things are happening. So, but it seems as though the artists were already intuiting this in the 1800s, that can I make my painting brighter? How can I get rid of things that are sort of dragging it down in brightness space? So you have this situation. How does drawing directly in color, this is from the book, change a painting? You avoid so Matisse drew visible outlines around the surfaces and did so in a dark color. So if he did that, then the contours would be darkened. But color assimilation occurs due to mechanisms whereby boundaries control the filling in of surfaces. But Matisse wanted to create bright, glowing surfaces. So let the visual system do the boundary creation. And then, so what you get to present is what gets filled in. And so what did Monet do? He revolutionized the art of seeing. It was the method of expressing light in color and not value. So value in the context of art school is just the sort of shades of gray that you use. The landscape helped Monet determine how color expressed the light key was the first ingredient in a painting, not drawing. The untrained eye is fooled to think he sees forms by the model edges, not with color. Fool the eye into seeing form without edges. So that particular type of fooling is what in the late 19th century kind of came into prominence. They sort of present it as something that you ought to do, but it's more like something that you can do to produce certain effects. So here's another analogy you can make, that the boundary surface complementarity you can compare with the relationship between drawing and painting. You're painting to provide features that kind of go outwards and can bleed until they reach a contrast boundary. And with boundaries, you're specifying what the visual system anyway constructs if it's provided with enough information. So contrast among surface features can induce boundaries when necessary and blur others. So the subjective effects, which are so compelling for many people with impressionist paintings, are related in a way to the fact that they capture parts of how we do experience, like certain like hazy days or very bright days. And how does one capture that? You can capture things that photographs don't capture. And the blurring of boundaries that you can present in a painting may be related to the fact that when certain types of information are presented to the visual system, boundaries are blurred internally too. So this example that Steve gives, the pictures in the book are kind of low res, so I picked higher ones. So here's the Rouen Cathedral in full sunlight, 1894, sorry. And Here's the grayscale version. You can see that the luminance, which is conveyed by the grayscale image, shows that there's strong contrast. So you can get a strong feeling of depth. Whereas in this other painting from the series, 1882, it looks different. There's a haziness to it. And when you look at the grayscale version, you realize that much of the information is being presented in the color space and not in the value space. So that haziness comes from the fact that what is being used to create the edges is only present in the color feature space and isn't really present in this other space of darkness. And so that can kind of weaken the boundaries that we're using to decide where things are, and also weaken the sense of depth and order. There's a lot to kind of unpack there if you want to turn that into a complete model, but that's the sort of general hand-wavy approach to this. So to jump to the other extreme, have you guys heard of ligne claire? So it means clear line, and it's how Tintin comics are drawn. They're very clear, sharp boundaries are drawn. There's hardly any shading, no shadows really. It's partly inspired by Japanese art. And for Hergé, the creator of this style, it extended. It wasn't just about sharpness in the visual domain. There was a kind of sharpness in the plot also. And this, you know, in my mind, is related to this idea that action requires edgy information, for lack of well-bounded information. So it's very suggestive that for an artist using sharp contrasts that produce sharp edges is a few steps away from action, in a way that vagueness, like contours that allow for a lot of bleeding, produces a different effect, which is not quite action. So the feeling of suspension that you get from certain paintings may relate to the fact that your motor system is less sort of primed to expect things to act on when you don't have sharp edges. And that brings me to the connection that I've been thinking about for a while between the first verse of the Tao Te Ching and boundaries and subtleties. So the first verse, many people have heard, the first part of the first chapter, the Tao that can be expressed is not the Tao of the absolute. But right after that, there's this idea. Without expectation, one will always perceive the subtlety, and with expectation, one will always perceive the boundary. Now, with the idea of boundaries that you get from Grossbergian vision science, this has a whole meaning that is very interesting, because having strong top-down expectations can kind of compensate for even lack of boundaries in the world. And you can take this outside of the visual domain also. And this verse has many translations. And I like to look, whenever I go to the bookstore, I like to pick up the Tao Te Ching and see how people have translated these lines, because there's a lot of variability. So sometimes the very same lines are translated as ever desireless, one can see the mystery, ever desiring, one can see the manifestations. So for a while I was like, well, I can see mystery and subtlety, why that relates. But then why desire and expectation? Or why boundary and manifestation? So now with that what stream and where stream in the back of your mind, you can see that in order to act in a way that, with desire, goal-oriented way, you need sharp boundaries in order to pick things in the world to act on. And you can extend this to even other types of representations. The clarity with which you're able to engage with them relates to their distinctness. And so turning a desire into an action kind of requires something on the part of what you're perceiving, to the thing to which the action is oriented. So in all these mystical traditions, they tend to say, well, conquer your desire, do not want, all those things, right? And what does that pull you towards? It's like not making those boundaries, both on the side of the objects and on the side of your desire, and to have a sharp boundary between, say, your own sense of identity and everything else. So this idea of a boundary and the fact that it is there's a kind of a knob controlling how sharp it is a kind of rich idea, which Steve, I think, is quite aware of because of what he said about mysticism, but didn't elaborate on it here. So maybe he'll come back to it at some point. But I thought that was a fun connection to make. And I've written about it a little bit also. So yeah, that's what I had.
I think Friston would have something to say about equating expectation and desire.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really interesting one too.
Yeah. Because you can reframe goals in terms of expectations is his whole game, right?
Yeah.
And that fits, I think, quite nicely with this, in the sense that when you make a sharp distinction between perception and action, you may not see the mathematical similarities. Like just, well, perception's over there giving me raw material, and then there's action over here. But there's a sense in which the thing that bridges them is this, right? That top-down expectation constrains what you see, and how you see constrains what you choose to do, given some pre-existing drives, of course. So typically, when you're not extremely hungry or something like that, there's many things you could be doing, and what's available, the affordances in the environment will further constrain that. Otherwise you'd be stymied all the time.
But I guess the word affordance acts as that sort of bridge. An affordance is the thing you can see. It's a way of seeing a thing that is an action-oriented way of seeing a thing.
Exactly, which is why the diagram on the right here is really interesting from the perspective of what information is conveyed in each stream, and why like being extremely goal-oriented is like, it's tempting to say, is sort of draining the color from life because you're seeing the world in black and white in terms of good and bad, desirable, undesirable, well-formed or not, in various ways. Well-formed with respect to your goals, basically, or your history of expectation. So like, it's always fun to go to a museum with someone who doesn't often go to a museum, and who will often say things like, these artists are wasting their time, they're not doing anything productive. and they often will not even see what some of the detail is present in a painting, because they're thinking about what it's for. And that's a particular mode of experience that all of us fall prey to. So I find it fun to frame it in this way.
This point, I think it's very important to point out one of the things that almost nobody but Steve picks up on throughout his work, which I think is most easily understood in his 1982 Psych Review paper, which is that in terms of affordance, or in terms of how we learn and how we can use that to improve future action, there has to be an asymmetry between unexpected omission and unexpected occurrence. And that is not just in outcome, although in this paper it's all about outcome, but also about, as we sample information in the world, our brain behaves very differently when there's an unexpected omission and when there's an unexpected occurrence.
Yeah. That, in fact, relates to some work I'm doing now to do with hippocampus and context representations. There's a reason to assume that one of these asymmetries manifests as we generalize stimulus associations, but don't generalize contextual associations. And what that means is that if you associate, say, a color with foot chalk in the case of these rodent experiments, if that association has been formed, the extinction will be context dependent. So if you extinguish that, meaning that you present the sound or the light without any consequence, and you do that over and over and over again in a cage, the animal will learn not to respond to that particular stimulus in that way, but only in that cage. As soon as you move the animal to a new cage, the full-fledged association shows up again. So that's a version of the asymmetry here, because unexpected presence will cause you to associate things, but in a general way. You won't even necessarily use your contextual information there, but an omission will cause context-specific learning. So you could think of context in general as collecting all the exceptions and maintaining them, and which is why your inability to keep them in mind can actually vary depending on how tired you are and whether you're distracted and your emotional state, because all your exceptions and provisos and things like that are right, literally provisional. Whereas but I think this asymmetry also works for positive associations, meaning that when you associate something with food, extinguishing that is also context dependent. So conditioned place preference and conditioned place avoidance seem to have the same asymmetry. So just to kind of give, the way I like to think of it is that the learning system is optimistic about presence and pessimistic about absence.
What I find so puzzling about this kind of thinking is that in some situations it's very clear what constitutes an absence or a presence, but in many situations it might not be. What if I'm constantly seeing orange and then I see blue for a moment and then I see orange again? You know, both are stimuli, but I need to be able to identify one of them as a background and absence of stimuli, and the other. And is it just how often I'm seeing one or the other, or what?
That will, I guess, depend on the nature of the expectation. Because so it's difficult to know, and in the case of these rodent studies, which is where most of those types of association studies come from, they don't have very high, you can't do associative learning on complicated objects. So it would be interesting to know if there's some intermediate between the two situations that I described. I suspect there will be, where certain types of higher order objects are by virtue of being so rich, a little bit like context, and a little less like red light or things like that. Because the same region of the brain, the hippocampus, seems to be involved in these types of things, because they say that it's needed initially for conjunctive representation. So when you're doing logical and operations, you seem to need the hippocampus initially to form the association. Once the association is formed, you can remove the hippocampus and those associations remain. So there's some sort of transfer. But for simpler associations, which are not conjunctive, and what that means, like you said, it can be difficult in more rich environments to know what the difference is. You don't need the hippocampus for those types of associations. So you could maybe work backwards from there, but there's definitely a lot to kind of delineate in that spectrum.
So to take on the auditory version of your example, which is mismatch negativity.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I mean, that obviously seems to really be a lower level, sensory function, among other things, because we, see deficits of automatic sort of deficits in people that have schizophrenia, which, is not a disease associated with the hippocampus or, many higher level learning areas. So, obviously it has to do with that even lower level sensory cortices adapt, and we know repetition suppression and visual cortex. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different paradigms where the response, very quick response in primary sensory cortices, adapts to a consistent environment.
Yeah, we'll have to devote some time to the auditory stuff, because there's some interesting, there's even those auditory chimera experiments are really interesting and relate to this high spatial and low spatial. But in this case, it's high temporal and low temporal envelopes of sound can be separately kind of manipulated. And so there's a lot of interesting top-down and bottom-up stuff there too.
Has anyone done a mismatch negativity with gaps in a consistent sound? I think that would be just a fun sort of illustration of the fact that, it's not obvious what constitutes a stimulus and what constitutes an absence.
Right. Apparently, humans can sense a 2 or 3 millisecond gap in a constant sound. It's amazing.
Yeah. I did a little bit of reading about gap detection, and just slightly different sizes of gaps could certainly constitute an oddball.
Yeah. And just think, the width of an action potential is 2 or 3 milliseconds.
Yeah, it's
we
crazy.
We can sense that. So that's super cool. Let me stop the recording and we can chit chat.